November is getting close, and that means that the election is right around the corner. For quality coverage of all aspects of the election and expert analysis on top stories from around the world, there's no better place than the DSR Network. Members of the DSR Network get exclusive access to members-only segments of our podcasts, an ad-free listening experience, and access to our Slack and Discord communities where you can connect with fellow members and us. For the month of September, use code SNARK for 30% off your subscription at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code SNARK at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. For some time now, Donald Trump and his allies have been pushing Nebraska's GOP-controlled state legislature to change how the state's electoral college votes are allotted. If Trump had gotten his way, Kamala Harris would not be able to win the election with just the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, a potential boon to him. But that scheme appears to have fallen apart. On Tuesday, Nebraska's Republican governor announced that he will not hold a special session to change the rules, dashing Trump's hopes. Why couldn't Trump get his way with Republicans here? Is this over for good? And what will the impact of it be going forward? Today we're discussing all this with Joe Perticone, who has been covering this effort as national political reporter at The Bulwark. Thanks for coming on, Joe.
Glad to be on.
Okay, in Nebraska's split system, each winner of each of the state's 3 congressional districts gets an electoral vote. Joe Biden won the 2nd congressional district in 2020, getting that 1 electoral vote for himself. If Harris wins the 3 blue wall states plus all other Dem states, that gets her to 269. 1 more out of Nebraska gets to 270. Joe, Republicans control the legislature in Nebraska, yet they could not get the votes to change the manner of appointment of electors. You spoke to Nebraska's senior senator, Deb Fischer, and she said to you, it's over. What happened here exactly?
Well, the votes weren't necessarily there for them to do this. The governor was considering calling a special session where they would, in one fell swoop, change the rules, but they just couldn't get it there. And, this had been a part of a much broader effort. Lindsey Graham had trekked down to Nebraska the other week, and he was saying, even as recent as this weekend, that it was a 50-50 chance that they were going to get this done, which is why I went and found Deb Fischer in the Senate and asked her, and it was kind of a shock when she said, oh no, it's over. Like, the plan is dead. I was shocked because I was expecting, a final attempt in the final hours, but they just couldn't get it done, which doesn't mean it'll be like that forever. It just means that for this coming election.
As you say, Senator Graham went out there to personally push for it. I mean, Trump's people really brought intense pressure to bear on Nebraska Republicans over this. Why couldn't Republicans get the votes? Is this a function of Trump alienating Republicans on the state level?
Yeah, these state legislatures, they like to go by the beat of their own drum. They don't necessarily want to be carrying out a Trump agenda all the time. And so the fact that this wasn't a years-long effort, if the Trump people had started this years ago, they would have gotten to it. But this was kind of a last-ditch, here's another quick fix that we can do so we can, add another electoral vote to our victory. Naturally, they don't want to change this rule in Maine either because the opposite would happen. They wanted to do this, and they couldn't do it in time, and it was very representative of how Trump and the people around him behave a lot of the time. Suddenly that someone gets an idea and they think that their pressure campaigns can work, and sometimes there's just not enough time. But like I said, it can always change in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because what that brings to my mind is that maybe a few months ago, when President Biden was still in the race and he was polling well behind Trump, there was a lot of hubris in the Trump camp at that point. I mean, I think Tim Alberta reported that Trump's campaign managers, co-campaign managers, were basically saying, we think we can do this in a landslide. I mean, the way Trump was acting at rallies was, I got this thing in the bag. The Trump world was just absolutely just brimming with overconfidence. I mean, I think when they picked J.D. Vance, the expression on his face to me said, "Wow, we got this. We're gonna win. It's a sure thing." And now maybe it doesn't look as sure. And I wonder, to what degree do you think that's fueling this?
Oh, definitely. I was at the RNC all week in Milwaukee this summer, and I had never been to a more jubilant gathering of Republicans. That just doesn't happen. And they were thrilled, they were excited, they were extremely unified, and they were fully acting as if Biden was going to stay the nominee. It was very shocking to them that he decided to step down. They also they can't really fathom, selfless acts like that either. And so they were just operating that that won't happen. Why would he? Our guy wouldn't. Why would he? And so Harris, not just Harris joining in, but I think there's been a real shock that people have responded to her very well. And because of that, she's gotten a lot of momentum, and it really hasn't slowed. It's not, snowballing, but the fact that her favorability has remained very strong. People don't know much about her, but the more they do, they don't sour on her, which is the opposite with Trump. The more they hear from him, the more they don't like him. And so it's just been constantly trying to figure out, how can we win this thing or stop this thing from being lost? And this is just a perfect example of that.
I think part of this has to be that the Republican attack machine can't seem to land a hit on Harris. Trump himself, who famously thinks his nicknames just essentially cause people to evaporate into thin air immediately upon impact, he can't get the nickname for Harris right. We've seen him do weird things with her race. And I think there's a sense maybe among Republicans that the attack machine isn't doing what it usually can do. And I think that maybe is fueling some of the scrambling.
Yeah, definitely. And so for an example of an area where they aren't really winging it to the degree that I think they are, is in Congress, they have been pushing what's called the SAVE Act, which is, they say it just bars undocumented immigrants from voting, but that's already illegal. What it really is a pretext for election denial. So let's say they were to get the SAVE Act into law, it would do things like purge voter rolls. It would discourage voter registration because of the penalties for potentially being involved in registering someone who shouldn't be able to vote. So they kind of have a win-win scenario there, because if it were to pass, which we're now seeing it's not going to, it's going to be a non-starter. But if it did, it would dramatically upend the process by purging voter rolls and whatnot. But if it doesn't pass, which it's now not going to, they've caved on that government shutdown-wise, they are able to use it as a scapegoat, because undocumented immigrants are this, faceless entity that doesn't have legal recourse the way a voting machine company does. And so you're going to that's been a months-long concerted effort. And I've noticed that on the Hill, is that once they introduce this bill, this has become the predominant thing that they're saying will cause election fraud. Immigrants voting. It's unprovable. It's just a narrative that forms, and there's no way to really push back on it other than to say, show me proof.
It's like a ready-at-hand pretext that you can just grab off the shelf whenever you want. I think if I understand you correctly, you're saying that they're kind of winging it in terms of coming up with new ways of, subverting the outcome if they lose, right?
Yeah. After the election in 2020, it was Trump saying they cheated, and they just started thinking of different ways to say they cheated. This has been, for much of this year, on Capitol Hill, they've been pushing this narrative that there's going to be mass voter fraud by undocumented immigrants. There's no evidence that's ever happened. There's no evidence that's happening now. But that's been the constant theme. And if you ask any Republican member of Congress about things like election integrity or what's going on with the status of this bill, all of them are saying the same thing, which was not the case in 2020.
So I think you can kind of see this last-ditch effort in Nebraska in that larger context. Let's talk about the impact of the failure of it. Right now, the polling averages have Harris ahead in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, though it's very close. At the same time, though, she's behind a hair in Arizona and North Carolina. Nevada is incredibly close. Georgia looks tough for her, I think. So I'm a little torn here, Joe. You can really envision a scenario in which she only wins the blue wall states, which would mean she would need that one Nebraska vote. But on the other hand, if Harris wins the blue wall states, it seems like she'd probably take one more state with her, maybe Nevada and potentially Arizona. I mean, I guess Nebraska is an insurance policy. What's your sense? Is this outcome, the failure of this in Nebraska, potentially important?
All of the members of the Nebraska delegation, they signed a letter that sent it to the state legislature being like, please do this, get this done. Deb Fischer, Pete Ricketts, even Don Bacon, who brands himself as a moderate, was part of this. They wanted to change it. Yeah. And they wanted to change this rule because they know that a winner take all is better for Republicans. If that wasn't the case, they wouldn't do it. And so this effort, it's just, it would be a massive, they'll look back on regret, it not being able to get this done, which is probably why it would change between now and the next election cycle.
Do you mean that if she wins with just 270?
100%. If she wins by a significant margin, I don't know, maybe they'll revive it. But if she were to win just with 270 and winning Omaha was the thing that did it, guarantee they get rid of that thing by 2028. Why wouldn't they?
Can you imagine the explosion in right-wing media that would ensue in that latter scenario? Yeah.
And certainly if this would be getting into, different areas of campaign politics, but anyone who stood in the way of it will face retribution as well, whether it's through primary challenges or someone being blamed. That Trump would lash out at someone, like he'll lash out at the governor, you name it. Maybe he'll lash out at Deb Fischer for acknowledging that it was over before it was technically over.
Clean water, fresh air, our health, electricity. We tend to take for granted the things that matter most, like the separation of church and state. For more than 75 years, Americans United has been on the front lines defending your freedom to live and believe as you choose, so long as you don't harm others. But that right is not a given. Every day it seems like Christian nationalists are hatching new plots to force us all to live by their narrow beliefs. Backed by $1 billion shadow network, this vocal minority is pushing their anti-democratic agenda everywhere. But here's the thing, you can make a difference. Join Americans United for Separation of Church and State and our growing movement, because church-state separation protects everyone. Learn more and get involved at au.org/TNR. Yeah, I mean, that brings to mind that this is actually kind of brave of some of these Republicans to hold the line. I mean, assuming this holds, it's sort of a form of poetic justice. Trump has treated countless state-level officials as little more than pawns in his corrupt schemes to invalidate elections he loses. In 2020, tried to get Georgia's elections officials to literally find the votes he needed to win, tried to enlist many other state-level officials in his fake elector schemes. It's kind of endless. If Trump loses, there will probably be more schemes like this. Do you think that this sort of holding of the line, this act of, I guess, courage, suggests that more generally, state legislators might be more reluctant this time to go along with such schemes?
I think it certainly depends on the state. If you look at Georgia, Brian Kemp has, I think, created a model for not sucking up to Trump, but also not he's not a never Trumper by any means. He's not liberal in any possible way. He is just as far to the right as most of them. He's just not sucked up to Trump, and he's told Trump no when it's mattered. And he's remained extremely popular. And so if you see that replicated elsewhere, but there's a lot of Republican governors who have centered their identity around Trump, especially when you look at the bench for who might run if Trump doesn't run for a fourth time. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she would easily be a top person, and she has centered and owes much of her career to Trump. So it really depends. Greg Abbott, that's another one too. Covering the campaign before it fizzled out, the primary campaign, there was, what is Nikki Haley doing? Well, in a scenario where there's somebody trying to assume the mantle of Trump, Nikki Haley isn't that person, because the person who's saying, I told you so, is not going to be embraced by the party. It's going to be the person who maintains the MAGA-ness mostly. And I think that if there's anyone who's outside that realm, it's probably someone like Brian Kemp. And maybe it's someone in Nebraska who might end up getting in trouble over not, pushing this through.
Kemp is such an interesting figure in all this. I mean, he has demonstrated not just another way, but another way that works smashingly well. I think you're kind of getting like at this weird split screen thing that's going on with the Republicans right now. On the one hand, a bunch of them are getting bounced out of the party, already have. Obviously, you've taken the Liz Cheney route. Anyone who voted for impeachment, gone, right? Anyone who dared to say that the January 6th commission was quasi-legitimate or whatever, or most of the Republicans who wouldn't go along with Trump on January 6th, a lot of them out of the party. So that's on one hand, but on the other screen, you've got these figures like Kemp and these figures in Nebraska who are resisting and hanging on and sort of showing this other route. I mean, can you reflect on that a bit? I mean, the party is still really in sort of turmoil and real ferment over Trump in this sense, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's, those individuals are very much a small minority.
Yeah.
I was on the campaign trail with Larry Hogan this past week, and he's another one who's a much different direction than Brian Kemp, obviously, who, if he were elected, he's probably not going to be, if we're being honest, but if he were in the Senate, he would be more of a moral check on the Republican Party than an actual functioning legislator. And with Mitt Romney retiring, that person's not going to exist unless Hogan pulls off a miracle.
It's a good point. There's really nobody. There are very few of these people left, and yet this very big thing just happened. Can I ask, just to close this out, is it going to hold? Is there a scenario in which they come back? Maybe if the polls, imagine if the polls start to look like those three states or the blue wall states are really starting to get a little wider for Harris, which could happen. But those other states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, remain very close or with Trump ahead in a few of them. Then maybe it really becomes intense, the pressure, right? Is that a scenario that could happen?
Back in Nebraska, they're out of time. So in order to be able to do this, the governor would have called a special session, and he said today that he's not going to. And I think they'll split because they have to run for election too. So they don't want to be stuck the same way we might avert a government shutdown this month is the only reason why. It's because they want to be out on the campaign trail. And there's no motivating factor like forcing a member of Congress or a member of a state legislature to work when they don't want to work.
That is certainly true. I think for people like me, we never can really accept it's over in a situation like this. I just sort of can't help but feel like if this really got to a point where it really could very clearly make the difference between a second Trump presidency and not, I would think they'd do it, but maybe not.
Maybe not. And then that's something that I'm sure lawyers are examining with a fine-tooth comb right now is what could they try to do after the fact? in that period in December. We have no idea and what's legal. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I guarantee you people are looking into it or have it in the back of their mind.
I would not be at all surprised. On that cheery note, this is never going to be over, people. Never, ever, ever. Even if Trump loses, it will continue. Joe Perticone, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, make sure to check out some new content we have up at TNR.com. Tom Hartman looking at how Fox News' future may be on the line in a Reno courtroom right now, and Martin Skladany looking at how the anti-abortion movement undermines democracy. And check out the latest episode of Words Matter on the DSR network, where Norm Ornstein and Kavita Patel break down the past week in the presidential race and the ever-increasing absurdity of the Trump campaign. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.